Now then, team. No outside walking intro today. Did just try to do one, but it is super stormy out and the audio is impossible. So, we'll do it from the van. In this episode, I sit down with Emma Cherniavsky, who is the chief exec of UK for UNHCR. UNHCR is the United Nations Agency for Refugees. They work in 130 plus countries supporting displaced people. Emma has had a very diverse career, from the US State Department to Human Rights Watch to being the Deputy CEO of the Liberal Democrats here in the UK, and now leading the UK arm of the UNHCR. So in this episode we talk about the reasons behind the increasing number in forcibly displaced people, the impact of conflict and climate change leading to an increase in displaced people, how the media often tells a false story about refugees, how to protect staff well-being when they're consistently around highly pressured, sensitive, emotionally draining work. And also we talk about staying hopeful in bleak times. So grab a brew, hope you enjoy the conversation, and see you in a bit. Emma, thank you so much for coming on to the Causes show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive straight in. Take this is an intentionally holistic, intentionally ambiguous question. Who is Emma?
Wow, that's quite a starter question. Well, I suppose for me, my purpose-driven career has always been a really big part of my life, and I have had the privilege of living in different places and having sort of a global family. And in fact, my grandfather, who was Ukrainian, was somewhat of a kind of an early version of a refugee or nomad, in that he was born in Ukraine in the late 1890s. He was part of a Jewish family, and conditions in that, which was then the Pale of Russia, were very difficult for Jewish people. And so he and his 10 siblings fled Ukraine and were traveling musicians, and they traveled and they played music all over the world in very remote places like Australia, South Africa, and in North America and in Europe across the concert halls. And I suppose there's just always been a tradition in my family of moving around and being a nomad. And so that sense of kind of place and, home really being defined by who you're with as opposed to where you are. And so that's always been for me. I've been educated in different countries. I've always been drawn to the outside world and interested in helping others in human rights, in humanitarian work, in politics as well. A little bit of a political junkie. And I suppose being a young person who I went to boarding school, I was away from home at quite a young age. Another defining part of me is sort of friendship and connection to others. And that's a really important part of what kind of home is to me, or what grounds me in this life of moving around and often working in countries or around causes that are emotionally difficult at times and very rewarding, but at the same time, when the work is demanding, and it kind of demands a lot of you personally and emotionally and intellectually, then having that, those friendships and the strong family ties, it's incredibly important to giving you that resilience to be able to carry out that difficult work every day.
Yeah. You've preempted some questions that are going to come later about home and the sort of definition that you have of home. I guess before we get into that, because it's important to not only your
your background and as to how you answer that question, but also the role you're in now, and also, you know, the very varied career you've had. Can you? So you're the chief exec of UK for UNHCR. For people who, because this is a sort of sector-wide audience, for people who aren't necessarily involved in humanitarian international development spaces, what is UNHCR for people?
So UNHCR stands for, and the United Nations is full of acronyms. So UNHCR stands for United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And this was an agency that was established nearly 75 years ago now, after the end of World War II, in order to provide support and deal with people who'd been displaced by the war. And UNHCR had a global mandate, with the exception of a separate UN agency called UNRWA. UN Relief and Works Agency was set up to assist Palestinian refugees who had been displaced by the war in Israel. So, but UNHCR was given the mandate for refugees in the rest of the world. And so while the agency initially had a focus on Europe, where, that was where the displacement crisis was at the time after the war, it was meant to be a temporary agency, but it wasn't, because after that there were other wars and other displacement crises. And so over the course of decades, UNHCR has worked, in really every country across the globe. And today we are in the sad position that there is a record number of people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes across the globe. And that's defined as people who are driven from their homes as a result of war, as a result of persecution. So this could be political persecution. It could be you're not safe to be living somewhere because of your beliefs or because of who you are. And then, of course, we are increasingly now seeing many people also driven from their homes as a result of climate change, as a result of, also economic insecurity. And so just in general, while, there are many, many people globally displaced, many of them by war and persecution, some of them by other factors. And then there's been a massive increase also in the number of people, what we define as internally displaced. And that means that you are still living in your home country, but you are no longer able to live, where you used to. So, for example, in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has displaced about 7 million people who have left Ukraine to live in other countries, and another 5 million are displaced in Ukraine itself. So the eastern parts of Ukraine and, south, where the war has been at its most fierce, people there have either fled outside the country or they've gone into other parts of Ukraine, primarily in the west, where things are safe. And the huge numbers lately of people who've been displaced many of them are internally displaced. So you see big numbers of internally displaced people in Syria, for example, which has an ongoing conflict. Of course, the situation there is changing again, which is incredibly interesting. And so what UNHCR does, but often in hand with other UN agencies, is to provide humanitarian assistance. So meeting the basic needs of people who are forced to flee. And that's hand in hand with the World Food Program, for example, with UNICEF, who works with children, and other UN agencies and international humanitarian organizations, but also very often national charities and local partners who work in the countries where we are. So it range from Lebanon to Kenya. I mentioned Ukraine. I've mentioned Syria. So all of the countries where there's displacement, we work and we help coordinate that humanitarian response with other UN agencies and with the international charities that people will be familiar with, like Oxfam, Save the Children, the International Rescue Committee, but also critically, we partner with local organizations who really know, who are part of the community, and who are able to really, deliver that work at the community level, which is so critical to its success and to its sustainability as well over time. The other, I think, really interesting aspect to UNHCR is that we are a bit different to other UN agencies because we have a legal mandate from the United Nations to ensure that countries uphold the UN Convention on Refugees. So this is a legal international treaty that was agreed back in 1950. And so as a result of that, we are engaged in policy work with governments to make sure that they are meeting their obligations under the Refugee Convention. And when governments are not meeting those obligations, we will be speaking out and really highlighting how governments need to change their policies and change their practices so that the right to seek asylum and there is safety for refugees in the countries, in each of those countries.
Can you give us a sort of, what are the macro numbers right now, and what are the trends that you're seeing?
So we just recently passed the milestone of 120 million people around the world who are forcibly displaced. When I joined UNHCR about 4.5 years ago, that number was around 75 or 80 million. So there has been a massive acceleration in the last 5 years. That is due to a couple of factors. We've had, unfortunately, a number of new conflicts break out where the displacement numbers have been very significant. So Sudan, more than 10 million people now displaced. Ukraine, as I said earlier, more than 10 million people now displaced. And at the same time, we've seen other conflicts, the Syrian conflict, being a prime example, because there are 13 million Syrians who are displaced. Those conflicts have persisted and they have not resolved. And so more and more now, when people are displaced because of war or persecution, these refugee crises persist for years or decades. And so, in Jordan, for example, you have a whole generation of young Syrians who are growing up, who are now, in their teens, who have never known anything other than that displacement. When I went to Kenya last year to visit one of the largest refugee settlements or camps in the world, which is in the north of Kenya, it's called Kakuma. And that camp houses refugees from many different countries in the continent, but primarily people from Somalia and the DRC and Sudan, notably. And of course, this war in Sudan, the war that is there now, other wars preceded it. And Kakuma has been a refugee camp now for several decades. And so this is a situation where it's become the permanent home of 300,000 refugees. And Kenya, like many countries that neighbor countries that have conflict, primarily refugees live and want to live close to where their home country is, in the hope that they will be able to return home and that they will be able to maintain links with family and with community who are still on the ground there. And so countries like Kenya, countries like Uganda, countries like Turkey, which hosts, by far the largest number of Syrian refugees, or countries like Poland, which hosts the largest number of Ukrainian refugees. I think there's often a perception in some of the media that we have in countries like the UK or the US or across Europe, that all refugees are coming here, right? Coming to the UK or coming to the US. But in fact, the vast majority, 3/4 of the world's refugees live in lesser developed countries and in host countries that really are neighboring those conflicts. So it's really important to understand that the work that UNHCR does and all this, the humanitarian funding and the humanitarian response, it's incredibly important for those host countries to be supported and their economies to be resilient, to be able to integrate refugees, and that we see much greater success when refugees can be self-reliant. And so Colombia is a really interesting example of there have been a very large number of Venezuelans who have been forced to flee Venezuela because of conditions there. And Colombia has welcomed, I think it's about 2 million Venezuelans, which is a very significant number. And Venezuelans have the right to work. They have been able to access housing, integrate into schools and the health system. And this has actually been led to a lot of growth in the Colombian economy. And it's really an example of how when you see integration and inclusion, it can really benefit refugees who don't have to rely on humanitarian assistance and who can support themselves and their families with work and becoming part of the society that, they have moved to. It is much more difficult when that integration isn't possible, and when refugees don't have the right to work, have to attend separate schools, don't have a separate and parallel health system. And so we see now a lot of work that UNHCR does with development banks, and notably, very importantly, with the private sector and with business and with governments, because when you have, again, those host countries, when their economies are growing, when there are jobs that are open to refugees, and when you can see all of, these ecosystems, development, humanitarian, private sector, government aid, all working together to try to deliver those long-term solutions for refugees, health, education, employment, livelihoods. It creates much better outcomes for the host community as well as for the refugees themselves.
Mm. Do you recall a time when you've spoken with or worked with a displaced person or family, and the conversation has sort of challenged your thinking, and you've thought differently after a conversation?
Many, many times, because for me, it's really been a journey to understand the complexity of the situation, for refugees. And it's complex because the ecosystem, the situation for refugees varies enormously depending on which country they're in. So you have to have really a detailed understanding of the policy environment, of the sort of the history of the conflict, or the relationship, of these different communities that are now living together. And I think, most recently, what comes to mind is when I was in Kakuma refugee camp last year, it was to really understand the impact of cuts in aid that had happened at the camp. And I think I had not understood what the impact of those aid cuts were. So to be concrete, I went to Kakuma with a small group of sort of colleagues from other European countries, and we met with a group of women at the camp, and all of them were kind of heads of household, looking after children, and often also responsible for their parents. And recently, the World Food Program, which provides food in the camp, had been forced to cut their rations from the 85% that they had been receiving, 85% of the recommended daily amount, and it had been cut down to 60%. And this, for them, was the difference between they had been managing on 85% to feed their children and meet their nutritional needs, and now they couldn't. And they were being forced to skip meals. Their children were hungry. And it was just so, I just felt very, it really drove home for me that we live very far away from the lives of refugees who are struggling to just be able to survive. And I think when people think about the world today and how levels of poverty have generally, decreased, that economic outcomes for people are generally better, and, economic development has progressed for many people. I think there has been a step back in the last few years where a number of governments have cut back on development aid for various reasons, post-COVID, post-economic crisis, cost of living crisis. And these are very understandable political and economic developments, but the impact for people who are displaced and trying to survive is absolutely catastrophic. And it also leads to, in Kakuma, there were greater levels of insecurity in the camp. In other words, people were being forced to steal or, engage in antisocial behaviors because they literally were starving and couldn't feed their families. So the knock-on effect of these kinds of aid cuts it was so striking when we were there. And that really challenged me. And I came home just a lot more aware of that impact, and really trying to make the case for why supporting humanitarian organizations and development aid is incredibly important, for refugees themselves, but also, to create positive conditions in Kenya so Kenya can continue to be a welcoming host country for refugees. When that doesn't happen, and when insecurity increases, economic insecurity or, levels of safety are impacted, that will often lead people to move again. And so I think, I always make a very strong case for the importance of staying engaged with foreign aid and with development aid.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious about the personal engagement that you have with so that's one example, we've talked about one place, but you're around this work, UNHCR in 130 countries. I guess I've got, and sort of getting onto org culture and stuff in a bit, but how do you stay, if you're around this all the time? It's like it would be easy for it to be words on a page kind of thing. So how do you stay connected to those type of stories?
Been incredibly fortunate to have relationships with people who have lived experience of being a refugee in the UK. So I have a number of colleagues, some of the trustees of our board, UK for UNHCR's board, have the experience of displacement. And one of the very first things that we did as a charity is establish what we call our storytelling program. And so we have on our website dozens of stories that have been shared with us by refugees who now live in the UK and who've been able to rebuild their lives in the UK, but who have shared with us their experiences of displacement and their family stories and their personal stories of what it's like to rebuild a life in the UK. And I think we really know that in today's quite polarized world, where there can be a lot of very polarizing rhetoric around migration and around refugees, really, we want to be the counter narrative to that. And I think telling stories of refugees, how they are part of our communities, our tapestry here in the UK as a society, is a very effective way of resetting the narrative. And I'm not pretending that it is a great challenge and will continue to be, but I think sharing those firsthand stories and also the impact that refugees have had on the lives of communities. And so we often also hear from people in the community whose lives have been changed and whose lives have been touched by working with refugees, by engaging with refugees. And I think that it's incredibly important to provide that hope and that sort of inspiration in the world. I've also been very lucky to travel to the field And so, for example, when I was, again, going back to the Kenya theme, because I want to also tell, the story of some of the great things that have happened in Kenya for refugees. And one of the people that I met when I was there is a young woman called Monica Malith. And she had grown up, she's a young Sudanese woman, and she grew up in Kakuma refugee camp. And she fought from an early age to stay in education. She was at risk of a child marriage, which is quite a common outcome, sadly, for young girls who are in families with economic insecurity. But Monica really fought to stay in secondary school and just kind of overrule the wishes of her father. And she managed to finish her secondary education, and she applied for, UNHCR has a scholarship program for refugees to be able to attend university in their host countries. And she won the scholarship and enrolled at the University of Nairobi. She did really, really well in her classes, and she became the first student at the University of Nairobi with a refugee background to be elected student president. And she's training to be a lawyer. And she has, as a result of her advocacy on campus for the rights of students with refugee backgrounds to be treated equally and to have the same kind of rights as other students, she interacted a lot with the senior leadership of the university. UNHCR invited her to come to Geneva for the Global Refugee Forum. And in September, she spoke at the UN General Assembly. And, this is a young woman in her early 20s who is on her way to becoming, a kind of a symbol of hope and a role model for all young girls across the world. So there is so much inspiration from refugees like Monica who overcome incredible odds and who demonstrate what can happen when education, when rights are there. And so it's always about, kind of channeling and remembering refugees like Monica who are really providing hope for all of us.
Yeah, amazing. So we'll get into the sort of organizational stuff. And so UK for UNHCR is not UNHCR. So can you talk to me about the purpose, the organization that you lead and its purpose and what you're up to?
UNHCR as a UN agency, primarily the organization's funding comes from governments, but a really significant amount of funding also comes from private sector, what we call private sector partners. So corporations, trusts, foundations, philanthropists, and millions of individual donors across the world who support us generously with online donations, with, those supporter donations are incredibly important. And so UNHCR is raising money in this way in about 40 different countries. And so the UK, the charity was set up about 5 years ago to create really a much better way for us to engage with the public in the UK. It enabled us to provide a lot more transparency to donors about how their funding was going to be spent, for us to build up a lot more campaigns, including ways that people can be involved, to express their solidarity, to be part of some creative projects that we've launched, and to also be able to benefit from gift aid, which is a very significant way that charities, can amplify their work in the UK. So there are a number of these national partner charities for UNHCR in different countries. And we work together also to, deliver campaigns during Refugee Week, for example, or, to really try to build that global movement in support of refugees and the rights of refugees.
One of the things I want to do, because we will dive into your thinking on leadership and things, but I was just going through sort of your work journey. So on my notes, I've got US State Department, the World Bank, Pacific Council, a financial services company, Human Rights Watch, so a well-known advocacy organization, International Crisis Group, co-CEO of the Lib Dems, and now CEO of the UK for UNHCR. So it's interesting because when I was looking at that, I thought, I think versus a lot of people I've spoken to, you come at this from quite a mixed. There's a lot of it's not sort of just been UK charities. You've worked in a range of different organisations there. My question on this is, what strengths do you think you can uniquely pull on based on the sort of diverse career that you've had?
Really good question. And just to clarify, by the way, I was deputy CEO of the Liberal Democrats, just because I wouldn't want anyone to get upset about that. I think it comes down to being able to bring together the learnings and the lessons from different kinds of organizations, and within them, different working cultures. So I think what I learned working in politics, for example, extremely unpredictable, extremely fast-paced, and probably on balance, it was an extremely difficult, challenging period for the Lib Dems. They went from having, nearly 60 MPs to having 8 MPs overnight. The party, was on the verge or at risk of disappearing. And then for the 6 years that I was there, there were 3, successive elections that just did not deliver good results. And it was highly challenging to continue to motivate voters and members and donors to continue supporting. So I think when you are in a sustained period of crisis, you really learn a lot of resilience and of just having the patience and understanding that things will get better. And I think I think that's a really important skill, because especially when you're a leader in an organization, you have to really be able to ride out those difficult times. And it can be quite a long cycle of whatever challenge you might have. It might be financial, it might be reputational, it might be that there's a sustained economic crisis, and you really have to be able to hold and lead and problem solve and help others believe that things are going to get better and that there is a way forward, right? So I think that's what I learned from politics. I think at Human Rights Watch, where I was for 11 years, so that has been a very big part of my life, and I'm really proud of how much they've grown. At the time when I was there, it was a sort of turning point where for many years, Human Rights Watch had been a much smaller organization than the other very large and established human rights organization, Amnesty International. And I remember, routinely my conversations were, I'd tell people I work for Human Rights Watch, and they would say, "Oh, is that like Amnesty International?" And it was always the reference point, we were always the younger sibling or the smaller sibling of. And while I was there, the organization went through some transformation and visibility, and managed to raise a lot more funding, and went from, really vaulted to be a much larger, more global and better known international human rights organization. And I think that really helped me be on the front lines. And again, the belief in, if you carry out your work with integrity and you have a cause where you are, riding a wave of, greater awareness, greater engagement, and that there's so much impact to deliver, which there was in the human rights space at that time, and there still is, you have to be bold and you have to be ambitious. And that's the path that we've set for ourselves at UK for UNHCR is, we, in 2022, we raised £50 million, which for a charity that was 3 years old is pretty extraordinary. And it was an extraordinary moment because of the war in Ukraine. But I really believe that there is so much need for refugees, not only for the humanitarian response, but for the long-term work that we are trying to deliver for refugees, to be able to support them through education, through employment, and really bring about that self-reliance, that inclusion that I mentioned earlier. And I have really seen that the UK public and the partners that we work with, the philanthropic partners, the business partners that we work with, they really also believe in the potential to deliver these solutions, and these, transformations are going to change the life of refugees, climate adaptation and, economic empowerment and the power of education and, economic inclusion. So I really have a lot, maybe I'm being overly confident, but I think that in the charity sector, and when it comes to where we are in the world today with displacement, we have got to think big, because the solutions that are needed are very, very significant, and governments cannot deliver this response by themselves. We've got to see, the engagement and the impact that philanthropic partners have had in many other areas of, you look at, the health outcomes that have been delivered by the Gates Foundation for millions, tens of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And I really believe we're at a moment in world history where we need a transformational philanthropic initiative for refugees and for displacement. And I really think UNHCR is the best organization that is positioned to deliver that transformational change at that scale for refugees. But I grant you that it's a very ambitious vision.
What's good leadership to you, and what kind of leader do you aspire to be?
I think good leadership is very much first about listening. And I've really learned in my career, and I think, and I hope that I've brought this to the charity that I've helped build and lead for UNHCR, is it's very much about empowering the people that you're working with. I think it's about really being authentic around what you're strong and good at, and areas where you don't have all the answers, and where you really are going to be looking to others and working with others to help, them deliver that impact. Think also that this is, maybe a slightly darker side, that ethics are incredibly important. And I saw in politics, and we see this constantly now, that it's incredibly important to always stay true to your values, and to really guard your your values, and to always ask the right questions, and to be curious, and to follow your instinct when you feel that there's something that, may not be right. And I think sometimes in the world of fundraising, there can be pressures around accepting gifts, or around, financial pressures that, the organization needs to survive. And I think it's very important to be ethical in your fundraising sort of practices and the partners that you choose to work with. So I think this can play out in a number of different ways. And I learned for myself, politics can be it's a very high visibility and a very high risk sector. And so I definitely learned some lessons there, again, about asking questions and about taking time to get to know people. And I think also leadership is about humility. And it's very easy when you are fortunate enough to lead an organization that's successful, and lots of people are giving you credit, right? They're saying, you're doing a great job. It's very easy to feel that you you know everything and you've got all the answers and you really constantly have to listen. And so one way that something I found really useful, just to be concrete about it, every year I sit down with every member of staff and I have a sort of in-depth interview with them where I ask them, how are things going? What suggestions do you have? What problems are you having? And I think, some people have said to me, but such a large organization now, how do you possibly have time to do that? But I really have guarded that very, very strongly, because I think it's really important to really understand what people are experiencing internally and to really have an open culture around being able to be open with leaders and being able to, wherever you work in the organization, knowing that there's an open door to make a suggestion, to raise a concern, to, those ideas and that energy and, those experiences that are happening internally, that's the engine that drives us.
Yeah. So not so much UK for UNHCR specifically, but I'm thinking about that career journey you've had, and there being lots of moments in there that I suspect were high pressure. The context that you and your team are working in is, not only high pressure, but it's also sensitive. It's emotionally heavy. What do you think about sort of protecting your staff's well-being in that kind of context?
Very, very important. And I think it's becoming more difficult in a world where not only are we, engaging in supporting refugees and, again, some of the what it's like to understand the experience of those refugees. And I felt this very much at Human Rights Watch as well, where I was often, part of hearing about some really, really horrific human rights violations. And while I wasn't on the front lines, I was engaging with colleagues and sometimes would meet people from the field, who had really suffered horribly. And now, added on to that, we're living in a world where, because of social media and all the online world that we're in, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of kind of hateful rhetoric out there. There's a lot of attacks that, take place. And particularly for my colleagues who are in our communications team and who are engaging, with this content on a daily basis, there's a real risk around mental health, around resilience. It's really challenging. So like many charities, we've put into place a lot of measures to limit the amount of time that people spend doing that work, to provide mental health support, through our employee assistance program. People can access a counselor right away. And also just having a very open culture internally around mental health and supporting one another and feeling safe and open to be able to talk about, I'm not coping well, or I'm feeling overwhelmed. And again, it's a journey, and we have to continually work to ensure that we are supporting our colleagues with their mental health and, providing that balance also of people knowing that they have the time off that they need, they have the resources that they need to access, but also that there is, there are a lot of positive things that are happening also for refugees. And so it's that balance of giving people hope for the future and an understanding that, the work that UNHCR is doing is changing lives for the better. And I think that really helps colleagues when they meet with refugees, when we are able to celebrate those journeys where people are actually building a better life, which is what UNHCR is about. That really refills the well of happiness, that well-being, which is so critical, and it's incredibly rewarding. But it's something that we have to really be mindful of, especially now with this, the online world that we're contending with.
Yeah. Something you've reminded me of is there's lots of in harrowing context, you're sort of doing it because the whole point is you want to see the good, and I guess we talked at this very start about an increasing, the numbers of displaced people, the climate change, conflict increasing, all of these things. It's a kind of intentionally ambiguous question, but it would be very easy to be really depressed. So can you give us hope about the future based on the context that you have through your work?
I think I was reminded about this recently. I went to Moldova to visit programs there that are being supported by UNHCR. Moldova is a small country. It's the poorest country in Europe, and a population of about 2.5 million. And they have welcomed over 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. And I went to a refugee accommodation center in Chisinau, the capital, where at this point, sort of almost 3 years into the war, many refugees who've come to Moldova are now living independently, able to work and able to support themselves. But there are still some refugees, elderly people, kind of families with additional needs who are being accommodated. So we went to an accommodation center that UNHCR is supporting. And in rapid succession, I met 2 different refugees, and I'd just like to share their stories. The first one was an older woman called Nina, who is in her 80s. And she was from the eastern part of Ukraine. And in the early days of the war, her home was destroyed in a missile attack. And she told us that on that day, she had asked God to bury her as well because she didn't want to live anymore. And as you can imagine, she was very emotional in sharing this with us, and we all kind of joined her in the emotion that she shared about that was the lowest, point of her life, but that through, the kindness of strangers, she had made, her journey to Moldova, and she was now being looked after and was just very happy to be there. And then we saw how Nina had really found a new community with these other refugee families. And one of the families that we met, the mother, who's called Natalia, was from Odessa, and she had a 3-year-old son called Ivan who was living at the center, and she had a newborn baby who was called Ksenia, and she was holding Ksenia in her arms, and Ivan was sort of, that age at 3 when you're kind of climbing all around, and he was excited because we had camera with us, and he was like looking at the camera, and he was kind of playing a little bit. And, through all of this, Natalia was like sharing her story of how they had been forced to flee Odessa some months into the war. They had tried to stay, but they had been unable to stay because of the relentless attacks, and it became unsafe. And they had come to Moldova, and every day, Natalia wakes up and prays that the war will end because she really wants to go home. But at the same time, you could see the joy of her with her children. And then, we watched them playing with Nina, the widowed pensioner that I mentioned, and how there was kind of a new family forming there, right? These 2 families had come together. And you just realize that in the most difficult of circumstances for people, life is, still there are still joyful moments, and there is still hope for the future. And, I know that Natalia's dream of returning home will come true. And, I hope soon. And it just, seeing that next generation and the way that compassion, that empathy, that human connection, that's what the work is about.
A telephone company has come to you and said, Emma, we've got an opportunity. We're going to let you send a text to every refugee or displaced person in the world. Your confines are a text character limit. What is that single text saying?
Think I'm not a wordsmith, but it would have to be about being equal, and about your right to a better future. You have the right to a better future, and that that's just so fundamental, that all refugees deserve the same opportunities that we've had.
Amazing. Emma, thank you so much for coming on for an episode. Is there anything on your mind that you want to say before we wrap up?
I just would say that I know often when people read about refugees and the sort of news that's out there, that number of 120 million displaced just sounds very overwhelming. And I think behind those numbers, there are 120 million people, all of whom have their own story of challenge. And everyone, in that group deserves our compassion, our support. And there is so much potential. We are living at a time now where many countries like the UK, Japan, Italy, Germany have aging populations. And I think in the future, that potential for refugees to really, contribute and, be part of the labor pool in those economies where we are going to need people to look after us, to, continue to work in hospitality, to, really provide that engine of growth for the aging population. And I think that is something that it's a real hope for the future, that we will live in a world where refugees are welcomed.